Alright, so welcome back, guys. So without further ado, we're just gonna get into our story. So before I start, I remind you of the book that we're reading. The name of the book is Minty Alley, and it's written by C.L.R. James, and it's narrated by me, Karen Weir. Alright, so we're just gonna get into it. So if you've been following my page, which is Karen Vibes, so it's KAREN VIBES with an exclamation sign. You can go onto my page, and if you can follow from there, you would have seen where I left off. So as I said, without further ado, let us just get into it. Alright, so we had left off the last part where we read that Maisie was throwing out Miss Rose's clothes on the ground in the mud and everything and what have you. So as I said, just go onto my page, follow from there, and you can just pick up from that. So we're going to be reading part 4. So, "That is the end of you," she said, and coming down the steps, walked across the yard into the kitchen with her head high in the air, trampling Maisie's clothing into the mud. Oh, so this part, it wasn't Maisie throwing Miss Rose's stuff into the mud. It was Miss... Hold on, guys. I don't want to get confused here. Alright, so Miss Rose was the one who was throwing Maisie's stuff into the yard. Okay. So we read that part. Alright, so we're at part 4 now. "That is the end of you," she said, and coming down the steps, walked across the yard into the kitchen, with her head high in the air, trampling Maisie's clothing into the mud, as if she did not know that they were there. Haynes had said nothing, not a word, nor made any attempt at interference. But for the first time since he had lived in number 2, he was in a ferocious temper with Mrs. Rose. It had come at last, and he was on Maisie's side. He stood fuming for a minute, and then went to Maisie, who was sitting crouched in a chair, her eyes fixed on the ground, clutching at her hair with both hands. He put an arm around her and didn't care who saw. "Now listen to me," he said. "I am going out for those clothes." "You needn't waste your time. I don't want them." "You must have them. What are you going to wear?" She burst into a rush of furious fear. She burst into a rush of furious tears. "No. Promise me to sit here and wait until I come back in. Please, Maisie." She didn't answer. "Please. Promise?" All right, all right. "No, you are not going to come. You are not going out. No, you are not coming out to begin to fight again, are you?" "No, Mr. Haynes," and she gave him a reassuring squeeze. "Good." Pushing open the door, he went out and began to pick up the clothes. That he knew would annoy and wound Mrs. Rose. Miss Atwell came from the kitchen to help him. "Leave them, Mr. Haynes," she said. "That don't suit you. Look at the lodgers watching. What will they think? Look at your shoes and your trousers in the mud. Mr. Haynes." And then she whispered to him, "It's better she go, Mr. Haynes. It's better she go, Mr. Haynes. It's better she go. If she stay, it will mean sessions for one of them." "I suppose she will have to go now," said Haynes. "I don't see how she can stay after this," and checked himself in time from saying, "And I am going too." But he picked up the things in a way that showed Mrs. Rose and all who were looking what he thought. And then Maisie appeared, astonishingly at the window of the room Mrs. Rose had just locked with such finality. "Come on, everybody! Here!" she screamed, and she pitched one of Mrs. Rose's dresses through the window into the mud. "Here!" she said, and threw 2 others. Mrs. Rose came to the door of the kitchen to see Maisie holding up a dirty underpant. Here, she said, and she did not throw it. She caught sight of Mrs. Rose and paused to speak to her. You are a bit old-fashioned. You are a bit old-fashioned. Mr. Ben and the Mr. Ben and the nasty, sorry, Mr. Ben and the pants nasty. She put it to her nose. Christ, but it stink. No wonder. Although the man come back, he had to leave again. So this is Maisie cussing Miss Rose over Mr. Ben who had left. She let it float to the ground. She let it float to the ground. Mrs. Rose rushed from the kitchen and in a second was on the steps. Just let me put my hands on you, she panted, and fumbled in her pocket for the key. Oh, you're coming to open, eh? Said Maisie. Come on, and continued with her catalogue. Here, she said, and Mrs. Rose's buttoned boots plunged into the mud. Old stuff. The days for buttoned boots over, old woman. Mrs. Rose turned the key and wrenched violently at the doorknob. It came away in her hand and she nearly fell backwards. I'm not laughing, it's not. No. She nearly fell backwards. Maisie had bolted the door on the inside. Here, she continued. Here, continued Maisie, remorselessly. She held up, as if gingerly, between finger and thumb, an intimate garment, a capacious intimate garment. She held it before the infuriated Mrs. Rose and dangled it so that the people watching shook with sniggering laughter. Ha, said Maisie, as if a long concealed light had broken in on her. I see now. This is why the man wouldn't stop. This is why the man wouldn't stop. I see now. All you look at is this thing. Old lady. People don't wear these balloons today. They make them out of Celanese now. You didn't see those the nurse used to wear? Mrs. Rose, talking distractedly to herself like a mad woman, had rushed up the steps into Haynes' room to find that the careful Maisie had pulled the bed away and after passing through the connecting door had locked it behind her. Oh my goodness. This is what you call hell and powder house. Boy, Maisie really door back bad. Oh God, show me a way, she screamed at last. She turned her face to the sky and raised her clutched hands and shook them at heaven in agonizing supplication. Here, said Maisie, and she threw a rolled pair of stockings so that they hit Mrs. Rose on the chest. And here is your hair dye. She poured it out. You lose the man. He ain't coming back a third time. So what you want with that hair dye? Show your dirty gray hair to the world and stop thinking of men. She lifted the bottle high as if she would hit Mrs. Rose with it, and she threw it hard into the mud instead. Haynes neither could nor wished to interfere with Maisie breaking up his life at number 2. For the moment, he pushed aside all thoughts of the future and stood lost in a fearful admiration at her winning her last great victory. But Father in heaven, what is this here today? Said Miss Atwell. What is it? Is murder, replied Mrs. Rose. She ran into the kitchen, took up the hatchet. She ran into the kitchen, took up the hatchet, and going to the door, began to break it open. But by this time, Maisie was finished. Stop breaking down your door, old woman, she said. Stop, or I'll break this bottle on your head. For God's sake, Maisie, said Haynes, that's enough. All right, Mr. Haynes, I'll spare her for your sake. She left the window. Let me just put my hands on you. Let me just, if I catch you, see, girl, said Mrs. Rose, over and over again, and made powerful strokes on the door with the hatchet. I can just imagine Miss Rose with the hatchet at the door. Oh my goodness, try to get the door open. And then, they say in Jamaica you have to take bad thing make joke. Ah, boy. Maisie had disappeared, but suddenly there was a shout from a few of the people who had crept into the yard to witness the disturbance. She had slipped through the window at the back. By the time Haynes reached round the by the time Haynes reached round, he could just catch a glimpse of her walking up Victoria Street, bareheaded in an old pair of soft slippers. No, no stockings. Her head and neck and half her dress still plastered with mud from Mrs. Rose's tumble, and a small crowd walking behind her. Gone, and gone for good. Wow, we have to take a. Wow. Mrs. Rose in the back had collapsed in a welter of tears and mud, and Miss Atwell was trying to console her. The usual. Miss Atwell always the one trying to be the peacekeeper. Oh boy, so we pause there. So I'm going to so this is actually the end of chapter 30. Yeah, this is the end of chapter 30. And then when we come back, we're going to go to chapter 31. So I'm going to pause here and come back.